like splashy, flashy mythic artifacts? I do too. Let's talk about 2 examples of this from Aetherdrift that I think are actually very strong. One from Constructed 60 card and one for Commander. And if you want to pick up singles or sealed product for Aetherdrift, you can use the code KENOBI. You're going to get 5% off your order, and it helps to support the show. And you get one of these free playtest cards that are themed around vehicles. Perfect for your party box. Let's begin with the one that was spoiled last week, the Aetherspark, the titular prize for the big death race rally in Aetherdrift. It is a 4-mana legendary artifact planeswalker equipment. Yeah, that's right, it's got a lot of different types on it. It has 4 loyalty when it enters the battlefield, has 3 abilities and 1 passive. The passive ability is as long as the Aetherspark is attached to a creature, the Aetherspark can't be attacked and has whenever equipped creature deals combat damage during your turn, put that many loyalty counters onto the Aetherspark. The +1 is attached to the Aetherspark to up to 1 target creature you control and put a +1/+1 counter on it. The -5 is draw 2 cards, and the -10 is make 10 mana of any one color. Now, the super important thing to consider here is that this is a 4-mana equipment with a 0 mana activation to equip it. Instead, it gains a loyalty, and it puts a counter on the creature that it attaches to. So it leaves behind a lasting buff when it's removed or moved around the battlefield to different creatures. The fact that it can be moved around to different creatures in different turns with a +1, a growth of loyalty and no mana investment, means this thing can rack up loyalty as it moves to flyers and other evasive creatures further down the line. Now, 4 mana for a +1/+1 counter on its first activation is not all that hot, but we really need to break down some elements of the card that make it so good. And I really mean this, I think this card is actually very strong. I'm more thinking for standard and one particular modern deck, and I guess it's fine in Commander. The reason I think this card is good is that it has a -5, draw 2 cards. Now, on the second turn that you have it, it's +1 to equip to a creature. Let's say it couldn't get through to combat, and it has 5 counters on it. You can now draw 2 cards, which is not the best rate for 4 mana, but for colorless mana, that's pretty good. The other super important thing that we need to note about how this card works is that it says combat damage on your turn. So you can't get loyalty by having a creature equipped with it block, but you can get loyalty by a creature equipped with it attacking and being blocked. So for instance, in the same set, there's a 7 power 3-drop in black. Imagine equipping this to that, putting a counter on it, swinging for 8 damage. They block it with a 1/1, and you put 8 loyalty on the Aetherspark. You now have a very high loyalty planeswalker that can literally ultimate next turn and give you 10 mana, but of course still dies to a Braid or similar. We'll talk more about that in a moment, which I think makes the card actually balanced compared to something like the One Ring, which was hugely imbalanced. The obvious comparison for 4-mana card draw spells is the One Ring, and the One Ring is probably one of the most broken Magic cards ever printed, or most powerful, should we say. No, but I'll say broken and powerful. I talked about this in the original video for the One Ring being revealed, but 4 mana to draw cards in colorless is very strong, to the point that it hardly exists throughout Magic. Prior to the Aetherspark and prior to the One Ring, the closest we had was Urza's Blueprint, which was actually 6 mana with Echo 6, so it cost 12. Coercive Portal is a 1-card draw a turn, as is Bottled Cloister, 2 examples of cards that I've seen play in Legacy. When discussing the first draft of this video with my highest tier patrons on my Discord, shout out to Pasta, who observed that actually Maze Mind Tome is probably the closest to this, where for 4 mana you get a card out of it, and then for 6 mana you get another card out of it, and eventually it gets sacrificed. You only get so many cards out of it before it dies, but in terms of colorless mana investment, it's probably the closest we have in current standard. Now, it's important to note that the Aetherspark does not draw you cards the turn it comes down if you have an empty board. It's actually very bad onto an empty board because it's a planeswalker and can be attacked. So your opponent doesn't need removal spells to kill it. They can just go to combat and attack it. And this might be the thing that not only balances it, but actually makes it not that playable. That's right, I'm gonna have the caveat for why it might not be as good as I'm thinking it might be, is that A, it being a planeswalker means it can be attacked, and with nothing on board to block it and no way to protect itself, that is quite bad as far as planeswalkers are concerned. And it's an equipment, which historically don't see a huge amount of play because they are quite bad again onto an empty board. If you're hugely behind, you've just been wrathed, you're clambering to find something on top of your deck to get you back in the game, top decking this and playing this will do nearly nothing. And thus, there is a window or a floor, shall we say, for this card to be actually worse than nothing. I guess the ceiling is quite high, but the floor is very low. And beyond that, it is multiple card types. It's an artifact, a planeswalker, and an equipment, and it's legendary, which means it has a large swath of things that can interact with it. A simple Braid will kill it. But one of the upsides of this card is that once it's attached to a creature, it can no longer be attacked. You can have a Planeswalker ticking up that is attached to one of your bodies, and thus your opponent needs to kill the body and then attack it, and ticking up to 5 loyalty puts it at a good spot for not getting one shot by your average creature in the 3 to 4 mana range, although 4 mana creatures are creeping up these days. A 4 mana colorless card draw spell is strong. We have to remember it's nowhere near the One Ring, being one of the most broken cards of all time, and also that card drew cards on its own. But the Aetherspark going up and up in loyalty is not going to be too difficult, because as you make combat damage with it equipped to stuff, it will just gain counters, and then it can be moved around to grow your team very small increments or just draw you 2 cards most turns. There will be worlds in Standard where you untap with your Shouldered in play after your opponent has not drawn the kill spell for it, because Shouldered's annoying to kill, and then you can cast your Aetherspark and equip it to the Shouldered. Yes, sure, some of you are going to comment down below, we broke Shouldered, but look, Shouldered isn't even that prominent in Standard right now. I'm just saying that there will be mid-range decks that can utilize this equipped to a difficult creature like Shouldered, and the -5 draw 2 cards is pretty good synergizing into her too. I guess the argument would be, how many 4-drops can you play in your mid-range deck when you're trying to play multiple Shouldereds and multiple Aethersparks? That's the really difficult one, but I'm sure this will find a home, perhaps more accurately, a mid-range deck with cheaper creatures like Glissa, and then you can equip this to a very strong body, powering it up, and get into the combat zone with evasion or problematic on hit triggers or first strikes or death touches and similar, and start ticking it up. Consistent card draw is difficult, and I guess the real argument is this consistent? Can you consistently get this up to 6 loyalty to draw 2 cards and have it still stick around? Hell, I think sometimes just trading it in, cashing it in for card draw, ticking it down, 5 loyalty and killing it to draw 2 cards will probably be reasonable too. It just seems like a very strong value piece, not a dominating or warping force, but I think a strong linchpin of some sort of mid-range deck in Standard. Now, the place that I think it might see play in Modern, or perhaps Legacy, is anywhere where you can play it alongside Stoneforge Mystic and Pure Steel Paladin. In the case of Stoneforge Mystic, you can go chewed up your Aetherspark and deploy it on turn 3 for less mana than you would normally pay for it, which is already a good spot to be in. Now, that means it is competing with things like Caldra Complete for being an aggressive engine that can, I don't say aggressive engine, an aggressive face-smashing win condition. But the Aetherspark instead gives you consistent card draw and the ability to, once deployed of Stoneforge Mystic, equip it for free. And that's the important point around this. Again, there is no mana cost to equip this, and thus, normally when you deploy a sort of Fire and Ice or a Jit or something similar off of a Stoneforge Mystic, you need to be able to deploy off the Stoneforge Mystic and be able to equip it, which is often quite difficult outside of the Pure Steel Paladin decks in Modern. But in the case of the Aetherspark, is you deploy it with the Stoneforge Mystic, you uptick it, you attach it to another creature and like your 1-drop or whatever, and you're off to the races. So I think a Stoneblade deck can monopolize on this quite strongly. However, then we get to Pure Steel Paladin, which is a Stoneforge Mystic deck in Modern. Pure Steel Paladin, when you've got Metalwork Online, will give this the equip cost of 0, and thus you can equip it to one of your creatures, like your Pure Steel Paladin or anything else, get into the red zone, make contact, put some counters on it, and immediately down tick it. If you put it on Pure Steel, for example, and there's a window to make the connection, you're up to 6 loyalty at that point, -5 down to 1 loyalty, you draw 2 cards. On the following turn, you can equip this wherever you want for free, or uptick it to put counters and stuff. Do you see what I mean? Being able to make it a 0 mana activation that then allows you to still activate a loyalty ability down the line seems good. I think the place that this would most likely see play is in a Pure Steel Paladin deck as a value engine and card draw engine. Of course, Pure Steel Paladin already does that off of itself, off of the titular title card, but I think it wouldn't shrug its shoulders at, and probably only a one-off copy because of the shooter package of 4 Stoneforges, but I'm sure it's not going to shrug its shoulders at the Aetherspark being a card draw engine that also has this like game-winning, well, I guess that's the point about the Ultimate too. The Ultimate isn't actually that hot. Sometimes you're -10 and do like literally nothing, but sometimes you're -10 and just cast your entire hand. So, I don't know. I think Pure Steel Paladin is a very good spot for it, and I still think it'll find some sort of home in Standard. Moving across to Commander now. The Radiant Lotus is the kind of Commander card that's very splashy. 6 mana artifact tap, sack 1 or more artifacts, and chiefly not itself. You can sack itself, you don't have to. Choose a color. Target player adds 3 mana of the chosen color for each artifact sacrificed this way. This card has got so much going on for it, deceptively, a huge amount. Firstly, I just want to go on record as saying that the alternate frames that look like Pokemon cards are ugly. I don't like these. They always look really busy and garish. Each to their own. If you like them, I respect you, and I'm glad you've got them out there, but I am not a fan. So it's a 6 mana big old mana rock, but it's a 6 mana big old mana rock that does crazy stuff. So essentially, if you have a board full of artifacts and this in hand, and you play it and tap it and sack a load of stuff, you're going to make tons of mana. 3 mana per thing sacked. Bearing in mind it doesn't say non-tokens, this is treasures, this is junk, this is food, this is clues, all that superfluous and shit that you get off of the cards that you play in your decks, even non-artifact decks for that matter, you can get 3 mana per one. And then you can do it on the following turn too after you've made more stuff, because Radiant Lotus does not sack itself. Huge haymaker of a card in terms of mana production, because it doesn't have summoning sickness and it comes down and turns your board into a huge mana engine. It's basically quite an expensive Ashnod's Altar with a tap ability, meaning you can't keep using it over the course of the same turn unless you introduce untap abilities. It's not quite Ashnod's Altar, but it's kind of close, right? But also importantly, compared to something like Ashnod's Altar, that this Lotus can sack itself to generate mana. Now that might seem counterintuitive because you know what to untap with it next turn, but if you were to sack this alongside the rest of your board to make a ton of mana, and then cast something like a second Sunrise or an Open the Vaults, if you sacked a load of non-tokens alongside what you were doing, they will all come back alongside the Lotus and you're kind of doing a reset. Yes, I am pointing out that this card is surprisingly good with what we would call eggs decks. Well, you can go into big eggs. Like, eggs are great, right? But what about big eggs? You ever heard of big egg? Oh, they're sick. This, of course, would get you a load of extra ETB abilities off of things like Solemn Simulacrums, Pentad Prisms, and other similar eggs or good ETBs. You can even sack your Panharmonicon alongside all your ETBs, and Panharmonicon will enter alongside your ETBs, and that should get you 2 triggers of ETBs. It's the good stuff. And the really exciting and weird stuff. So it's target player. This introduces 2 things. One, in a pinch, you can give someone else mana to allow them to cast something that might deal with a problematic permanent on the board. It's a political tool. I think this will come up very, very rarely, but it's cool that it has that mode. I'd love to see more cards do that, where you can give positive benefits to other players to play politics. On top of that, because it targets something, much like Deathlight Shaman used to do in Legacy, where it targets a thing in the graveyard to make the mana, it means it's not technically what we call a mana ability. Mana abilities cannot be copied by things like Rings of Brighthearth. Meanwhile, this actually can. Now, you only need an extra 2 mana, so the turn that you play this, activate it, you need 8 mana to copy it with rings. So I'm not saying that's necessarily where you want to go with this, but you can use it alongside Adric as another example of this in blue. But perhaps more excitedly, in the command zone of a Grixis deck, you have Ashnod the Uncaring, which literally says whenever you activate an ability of an artifact or creature that isn't a mana ability, if one or more permanents was sacrificed to activate it, you may copy that ability. You may choose new targets for the copy, which means with an Ashnod in play, so this isn't what we're including for this deck specifically, you get to activate this and get twice the mana for the things you sack. Shout out to Lucky Tiger on my Discord who said when we throw Naming Human would double the whenever trigger from the Ashnod. Now you have 3 copies of the Radiant Lotus trigger. If you sacrifice just 3 clues or 3 treasures, you now have 9 times 3. With a bit of quick math, that's 1 billion mana. You have more mana than God himself. The Catholic Church is jealous. This makes you a billionaire and thus a dickhead. I don't make the rules. Again, I don't think this is game warping. And again, I don't think this is actually a competitive card. I don't even think CDH decks want this. There will be turns though where someone untaps, casts Radiant Lotus on turn 5 or 6, and their board is so heinously packed full of just nonsense artifacts and inconsequential things that were made just by chance and happenstances, like, passively extra stuff of other cards. Academy Manufacturer is a good example of this for turning that thing up to 11. They're going to untap, cast this, and you're going to, clench your butthole because it means they're going to value Pound Town. Whilst there's a small chance that Aetherspark never really finds a home in spite of being a 4-mana card draw engine, I think Radiant Lotus will always demand some sort of price tag as being a very splashy, flashy, casual commander card that's going to do some work. Remember, if you're pre-ordering, go to coolstuffinc.com, use the code KENOBI at checkout, and I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now, dickheads.